Welcome to Series 1, Episode 10 of the In Her Financial Shoes podcast. Welcome to the In Her Financial Shoes podcast with me, Catherine Morgan, founder of The Money Panel, helping you to get financially naked. Listen in each week where we talk about that taboo subject of money. Listen to brutally real-life stories, step into our guest shoes and be left feeling 100% confident and in control. Oh, and we hate financial jargon, so don't expect any here. Small steps, big wins, let's go. Hi, and welcome to the show. So in today's podcast episode, we're going to be discussing the topic of philanthropy and how women and millennials can help to give back through wealth. Now, if the idea of using your money to make the world a better place is appealing to you, then you're going to love this particular show. Many women today want their investments to do more than just offering good financial returns. And actually, statistically, there's evidence to show that as women, we actually prefer to be investing against our values and our beliefs than we do chasing headline returns. We want our investments to support companies and causes that align with our values, putting our money where our values are, so to speak. Now, there are several ways that we can explore how to give back through wealth. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be wealthy to be able to do this. So on the show today, Lauren Janus, who's my guest, and I are going to be talking about traditional giving, ethical investing, and impact investing. Now, Lauren Janus is a philanthropist and she runs a business called Thoughtful Philanthropy. I still can't say that word easily. And Lauren is a native of the charitable giving sector with a huge passion for helping donors to get the most joy out of their giving. She spent more than 15 years wearing all manners of hats in the charitable sector, both in the US and in the UK. And a few years ago, she jumped to the for-profit side and got an MBA to better understand the business side of social change. And actually today, Lauren combines her understanding of the third sector with her knowledge of business principles to give donors the information that they need to become empowered philanthropic givers. So this is an area that we'll be talking about on the podcast today in how you can start to become an empowered philanthropic giver. I think I've pronounced that correctly. So without further ado, I welcome to the show today, Lauren Janus. A huge welcome to the show, Lauren. How are you this morning?
Thanks, Catherine. I'm doing really well.
Great. So could you start, Lauren, by telling our listeners a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. So as is probably blatantly obvious from my accent, I am American. But I have been living in the UK for a while, and I've actually had 2 children here. So I have 2 British boys, even though my husband and I are American, and we just really, really love the UK. So so we're here. And my background is primarily in the charity sector. So I've been working in the charity sector in the US since I left uni, and then even a little bit in the UK. So my background is really in kind of social change work and advocacy. Basically, if you've ever done phone banking, I've done phone banking. I've done protesting outside petrol stations. I've done visiting programs for care homes. I'm kind of your classic idealist. So if there's a volunteer program, I've probably done it. But after a while in the charity sector, particularly in the US, I became a little bit disillusioned with it. It's very complex. There are a lot of stakeholders and sometimes a lack of strategy. So I decided to kind of take a right-hand turn in my career a few years ago, and I went to business school. So I did that for 3 years while I was working. And when I came out of that, I realized that what I really wanted to do was focus on the donor. So the person who is giving the money or donating the time to a charity, and really help this person understand what charities can and can't do and how the overall sector works and how they can become just really more informed and engaged and at the end of the day, kind of more joyful givers. So that's why I started my business, Thoughtful Philanthropy.
I love that. I love the name of your business. It's
Thank you.
tell us a bit more about what does the word philanthropy actually mean?
Yeah, good question. So it's Greek, and it means basically love of humanity. So that's kind of a question I get a lot is, people say, well, I don't think of myself as a philanthropist. I'm not giving hundreds of millions of pounds a year. And that's really, I think, a misnomer because anybody, given the definition of philanthropy, any kind of act that you're doing to further or support humanity is philanthropic. So that's why I chose it as part of my name and my business.
Yeah, and that's really interesting, isn't it? I think certainly you're right. That's the concept is that, oh, well, I'm not wealthy. I can't afford to give back. But there are so many ways, aren't there, that you can give back that don't necessarily involve huge sums of money. And
Absolutely.
we're going to kind of go on to explore some of that in the podcast today. So in terms of your experience then, Lauren, so when you came over to the UK, did you notice a big difference then between how the US respond to the charitable sector in comparison to the UK?
Oh, massive differences. Yeah, I'm still uncovering them. It's actually one of my favorite topics of conversation. It's a very different giving culture here than to California where I was before we moved here. I mean, and they're equally fascinating and really empowering. I love both giving cultures. So in the US, it's much more focused on kind of impact and strategy, particularly if you're in kind of Silicon Valley, Pacific Northwest area. They're very focused on outcomes. Whereas I feel like in the UK, there's more of a sense of any kind of charity is positive, which is great because you have so much more of a trust of the charitable sector here than I think you do in the US, which you might think is a little bit unusual for me to say, given kind of the recent scandals that have come out in the UK with the bigger name charities. But I think that the very idea that those large charities are still so supported in the UK is really because of the giving culture of the UK public. Americans are much more skeptical when it comes to giving.
Right. So with some of those recent scandals in the UK with charities, Lauren, does that affect people's decisions into how they give?
Yeah, it certainly does. And I know that the bigger name charities that have been involved in scandals have experienced a downturn in donations, which is what you would expect. And I think that to a certain extent, they kind of deserve some scrutiny. Like, I mean, I do think that the media blows things out of proportion because that's their job. But I also think that it shines a really important light on what the charity sector is doing with the donations of very open-hearted giving individuals. So I think that it can be really positive for the charitable sector as a whole to kind of move forward and make people stop and think, right, okay, I know that I want to support these good causes, but let me think through a little bit more how this organization is working, how they're using my money, and how I can be a more informed giver so that I'm not just giving £10 a month and trusting them to do the best.
And how do people go about doing that? How is the best way to find out what these charities are doing?
Yeah, you got to do some reading and I suggest talking to people in the sector, but you can also just spend a lot of time on websites and look at annual reports. And I think that there's some main questions that you can kind of ask yourself as you're looking at these organizations. I mean, ones that I encourage people to think about are, does this organization have a clear theory of change, which is basically like a business plan? Is this organization, do they have a strategy for solving the issue that they are undertaking, or are they just kind of collecting more money to keep themselves in jobs and to keep serving the community for indefinitely? And also looking at other organizations that are funding them, you can look at some of the major foundations where they're putting their money, because a lot of the times those foundations have very robust research departments that are doing some due diligence on these organizations. And I think just kind of trusting your gut and thinking about the numbers. Kind of one of my pet peeves with charities is talking about, numbers of people touched or number of people served. And I think that's I think that's an unfair way to evaluate their work, because you can say, our organization served 100,000 people last year. Well, ask yourself, well, what might that mean? Does that mean that they gave the 100,000 people a bottle of water during an earthquake? Or does it mean that they, really sat down and worked with those people to rebuild their lives? So it's about stepping back and asking yourself some questions as you're researching these charities, and being a little bit more, kind of digging under the first layer and saying, I know that they want to do the right thing, but are they using the money in the most strategic way possible?
That's a really interesting point. So, Lauren, with your experience then of working both in the US and the UK, and you've told us a little bit about how you went into business studies through university, what was your kind of early experience with money?
Yeah, well, I was thinking about this before the show, and I've really been incredibly lucky. I had a very happy childhood. I grew up in rural Washington State, which is basically farmland in the U.S. And so everybody that I grew up with, it was a very small town. Pretty much everybody was middle class. I'm sure there was poverty that I was not aware of, but there was also no wealth. There were no rich kids. So, kind of everybody went to the same state school. Everybody did, public pool swimming lessons on the weekends. So it was all very, mundane. And I can never remember asking my parents for something that I really wanted and them saying, no. And that's mostly because it wasn't an option. This was before the internet. So it's not like I could have gone online and said, right, I want this, this really great new thing, because you couldn't buy it. So in that way, I think I was really fortunate. And my parents were professionals and, very, so, always didn't want for anything. But I do remember kind of in my early teens starting to get really concerned about the way my parents were, in my mind, not managing their money. And I have no idea where this came from, but I think, this was, of course, quite ridiculous, and they could have been a little bit insulted by me kind of always asking, are you sure you should have bought that? And I was just really quite worried that they were going to run out for some reason. And I think this was because we never, as a family, really talked about money. So I didn't know if my parents were saving. I mean, they were, but I do remember this sense of insecurity, especially in my teens. And I think that was mostly just because money really wasn't ever an issue. It was never, something to talked about, and never something that I thought that we needed, loads more of.
Yeah, it's a really common theme, isn't it? That money is still such a taboo subject.
Yeah.
And, certainly from people that I've spoken to about their earliest experiences, often the earliest experience is like a physical encounter with pocket money or counting coins, or, it was never a conversation with parents about money. It was always, either a message that they were being told, like, money doesn't grow on trees, or, we can't afford to do that. So that kind of that fear of scarcity around money. But often, actually, I think because if one of your experiences is not talking about money, then as you've just described there, it can throw up all sorts of emotions about potentially not having enough money. So even though your parents were saving, because they weren't talking about it, that gave you the impression that perhaps money wasn't freely available.
Yeah.
Did your experience growing up with money, how did that influence then the profession that ultimately you got into? How did that influence your decisions in terms of your own profession?
Yeah, no, interesting. So I remember when I was as I mentioned, I was quite idealistic. I was even more idealistic as a teenager than I was now, which is quite common, I know. But I remember talking to my grandfather, who was a successful businessman, and telling him, I was probably 14 at the time, and I said, I don't care about money. I don't want money when I grow up. I don't really need it. And I remember him saying, Lauren, you should care about money because it allows you to do the things that you want to do in life. And that really stuck with me, because now I feel like, even though I have really kind of devoted my life to the charitable sector, I am really thankful for the security that money can bring a person, that can bring me to pursue my passions in life. So I really think that sense of money bringing security and opportunity was something that I kind of was told early on, and it wasn't until later that I fully appreciated it.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I think they did some data around this, didn't they, to say that actually once you exceed, is it something like $70,000 in the
Yeah,
US, that you wouldn't be any happier if you were receiving any more money than 70 grand a year. And
exactly.
it's an interesting debate, isn't it? It's like how much, and I think one really good question to ask yourself is, what does financial security look like? What would you need to have that financial security? And for some people, it isn't an amount of money. Sometimes it can be. I mean, the coaching session I did last night with a couple, and we asked that question, and they both answered it very differently. One was very focused around the pounds. So, if I had £100,000, I would feel financially secure. And then the other person was like, well, why? What's relevant about 100 grand? And it was, when we actually got down to it, it was like, he didn't really know where he got this 100 grand figure from. It was just like almost like he just felt that was a good amount of money. But actually, when we talked about it, it was mainly about this concept of philanthropy and giving, and actually aligning your values to the physical pounds. So having £5 in your account, you could be just as happy as having £5 as having £10, but it's what you do with that money and how you spend it that aligns with your values and what creates you financial well-being. And what I wanted to ask you, Lauren, actually is I work a lot with women, so I do coach couples as well, but I specifically work quite closely with women. And there is some statistics, isn't there, to suggest that more women tend to give more of their wealth than men.
Absolutely.
Why is that?
Yeah, so that's kind of something that's agreed across the research is women are over and above more likely to give, to volunteer, to follow a charity on social media, to share their information with their friends and talk about it, and to even shop in a charity shop. So women kind of have all the cards when it comes to charitable giving. And I think what's less a consensus is why that is. I mean, certainly you can go back to women have a more sense of community and more sense of the value of family because of their role, in the family and the larger community. But I think that the reason why women are more charitable is really still kind of up for interpretation. And I think we all kind of have our own ideas about that.
I wonder whether it's just because we like talking about it more. I mean, certainly. My husband, if we're sitting watching TV one evening and you get those adverts that prop up, and if there's anything to do with children in Africa or anything like that, he's like straight on his phone. He's always wanting to contribute. But because he's, I guess, short on time, then anything that allows him to do it easily and quickly is, something that he would be more willing to do. And I wonder whether there is, I guess if men are earning more, they're the main breadwinner in some situations, particularly when women are taking time out to have families and things like that, that I wonder whether their impact is things that they can do easily that kind of tick that box to say that, yeah, I'm giving, I'm giving back and I'm doing this and I've done a direct debit and things like that. But it is a really interesting conversation. And I think as well with millennials as well, certainly we're seeing millennials that are wanting and willing to give more of their wealth. And you've done some research around this already, haven't you, Lauren? Can you just share some of that with us in terms of what is it that millennials are more willing to do than perhaps what we have seen in previous generations?
Yeah, no, there's quite a lot of research around millennial givers and just the millennial generation in general. What we do know is that more than any other generation, millennials are looking to align their investments with their personal values. So they're the ones that are driving all of the interest in socially responsible investing, impact investing, and strategic philanthropy. So millennials, they're not giving as much as other generations right now, which is probably because they're in their 30s and not making that much. But more of them are giving. So they're not giving larger amounts, but the majority of more of the population is giving in some form.
And has that got anything to do with the influence of social media?
I think so, definitely. I mean, the millennials are absolutely the social media generation. They're the ones we were talking earlier about. They did the ice bucket challenge, where they would challenge each other to pour ice over their head and raise money for one of the health charities. They do kind of no makeup selfies to raise money for organizations. So they're definitely the generation that comes together to give. They want collaborative giving opportunities. And they want to, talk about it with their peers, and they want to swap stories and get other people involved in their issue that they're interested in. So they're really the collaborative talking generation when it comes to giving.
Yeah, and I remember the ice bucket challenge. How long ago was that now? Was it, do we say 4 or 5 years ago? Yeah, it was huge though, wasn't it? Every time you looked at Facebook, it was one of your mates, standing in their garden, throwing an ice bucket of water over their head. I remember actually my eldest at the time, who's now almost 8, he must have been about 3, and he watched my husband and I doing it in the garden and decided he wanted to join in. And we're terrible parents. We didn't even think. We didn't fill the bucket with warm water. He just went and filled it up with the tap and then tipped it over his head, and he just screamed. It was hilarious. Evil parents that we are. But it's interesting, isn't it, how charities are thinking about different ways that they can involve different generations, and particularly millennials, into how can they build a campaign, a social media campaign, to influence how we are being able to create some more social value.
Yeah.
Do you think that that's important, that charities come up with some innovative ways to get more people supporting them?
Absolutely. And I guess my favorite example of that right now is the growth of what are called giving circles, which is basically it's like a book club, but it's a group of people who come together and learn about a certain topic together. Maybe it's homelessness or girls' education or whatnot, and then they pool their money so that they can make a single, more impactful gift together. This is really speaks to both the millennial and women's, I would say, zest for collaborative giving, because it's about coming together as a group, talking carefully about an issue, learning together, and then pooling resources. Everybody contributes £100, and at the end of the year, they give a gift of, £1,000 to a charity that they've researched really well together. So I think that's the more that charities and other organizations, I think, can use tools like giving circles, I think the more likely they are to attract kind of both women and millennial givers.
What a lovely idea. I have seen some of this actually with organisations already. Yeah. And particularly in my space, actually, there's a couple of companies that spring to mind that hold, for example, book clubs. And they'll get together a community of women, and they'll talk about their favourite book. And then, again, they'll use that, that it's a non-for-profit events, and then they'll use money off the back of that to support a charity of some description. I love that idea, and that's what I love about philanthropy, is it isn't necessarily about just giving wealth. Certainly there are instances, I'm sure, where people are being very, very generous with their wealth and actually planning ahead as to, well, what would I do with my wealth when I'm no longer here? Do you do any work around that, Lawrence? If a client has significant wealth on the other ends of the spectrum, and they're looking to find ways that they can perhaps when they're doing inheritance tax planning and writing their wills and things like that, as to how they can create a giving plan for when they're not here? Or
yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I am a fan of what's called giving while you're living, and really taking the time to figure out how you can do some philanthropic work or donations while you're living, because that's when I mean, you want to get the most fun out of it, the most enjoyment out of it. You don't necessarily want to wait until you're dead for the charity to start being able to appreciate your contributions. But that's obviously, it's all part of the package. Is you can certainly give while you're living, and then also dedicate a portion to your will. So I am working with a client right now who's in her late 70s, and she is very interested in kind of adolescent mental health, because it has affected her family. And so we're looking at ways that she can support. She actually volunteers with a local organization that helps teen mothers right now. And so we're looking at how she can continue giving to organizations like that while she's living, and then also think about setting aside some money in her will that she knows exactly where it's going to go to. So she knows the organization, how they're going to use it, so that she can have some peace of mind for when she's no longer here.
That's incredible. That's amazing. And aside from the kind of traditional giving and kind of getting involved with communities and charities, can we talk a little bit about ethical investing? This is an area that, again, I'm really starting to explore at the moment, because a lot of clients that I'm working with don't really appreciate or understand that when they're investing in the stock market, when they actually have the confidence to be investing in the stock market, that often when they actually realize some of the companies that they're investing in, tobacco companies, some pharmaceutical companies, pornography companies, all these different things, it really frightens them. And I think particularly women do feel the need that if they are going to be investing their money, they want it to be invested ethically. Can we just talk a little bit about the differences between an ethical fund, and what's the difference between a negatively screened ethical fund and a positively screened ethical fund?
Yeah, sure. So basically, I kind of talk about a portfolio of ethical investing and ethical money management. And on one end is your traditional philanthropy, which I think is important in anybody's financial plan, but I'm biased. But then you can start talking about, as you're saying, screened investments, which is saying these are some industries that I don't want my money invested in. And that might be tobacco, it might be firearms, it might be alcohol, whatever is important to you. In most cases, you can find a fund that screens out those investment opportunities. And then the next step is really what's called impact investing, which is where you're seeking out opportunities to invest in things that you do want to support. So that might be, wind energy, or pharmaceutical companies that are working on vaccines for the developing world. So on the one hand, you've got taking out the things that you don't want, and then on the other hand, you've got pulling in things that you do, and all of that together brings together your kind of consciously, ethically minded money plan.
Is there a big difference in the kind of returns that people would expect by weeding out some of those companies? Does that affect somebody's potential performance on their investments?
Well, I'm not an investment professional, so I can't say for certain, but I will say that there's loads of research out there saying that you don't have to sacrifice returns for ethically minded investments.
That's really interesting. I have done some research around this myself recently to show that as you just explained, there isn't a huge difference in returns. But I think for women, actually, often we're not necessarily investing just for good financial returns. Often women want their investments to support companies and causes that align in with their values, and that's more important to them than whether they get potentials of 7 or 8% returns, on their investments. So, Lauren, as well as how we can be thinking about investing in line with our values, how can we start to teach our children about this? Because I think one of those areas that's really meaningful for a lot of women is, how can we be investing differently ourselves, but also how can we be encouraging this kind of behavior for the next generation?
Yeah, absolutely. As a mother of 2 young children, this is something I think about quite a lot. And there was a really useful study that came out from the University of Indiana School of Philanthropy a few years ago that looked at how parents can, as you say, encourage kind of a culture of philanthropy in their children. And they found, what I think is so interesting, is they found a difference in between having daughters and having sons. So the number one way that you can encourage your children to be philanthropic is to be philanthropic yourself, and to show to let them know that you're giving to these causes, and let them know that it's important to you. What they found is that girls, as long as their parents are giving, they'll grow up to give as well. With boys, you have to be really intentional about it. So you have to kind of sit down with the boys and say, look, I'm going to donate this money to this charity because it's really important to me. Watch me click the button, basically, on the website. And this speaks so true to me, as I have a 6-year-old son right now, and I know exactly what this means. You have to be really intentional and say, this is important to me, and I think it should be important to you too. Let's do this together.
Oh, that's really interesting. And it reminds me, actually, so I have 2 boys as well.
Yeah.
And we often have like spring cleans, and we'll gather together a bunch of toys or books, and we'll take them down to the charity shop. And we are very intentional with that. We'll always involve them. Sometimes it's difficult because they're like, oh, I don't want to give anything away. Yes. And they start playing with toys that, they've been in the back of the cupboard for the last 2 years. But interestingly, how, we are very intentional with walking them down to the charity shop. They, if they can, they'll carry some of the items themselves. And then we encourage the reverse. So when we're in the charity shop, we'll maybe give them £1 and say, well, you can buy a new book or something while you're here.
Perfect.
But that's really interesting. So why is that different to boys than girls? Is that just the way that their brain functions?
Yeah, I mean, I think you probably have to ask a child psychologist, but being a mother to boys, I know that they just don't pick up on as many social cues as I think I did as a girl. And I don't know why that is necessarily, but the research quite clearly says that you have to, as you say, be really intentional about it with boys and say, right, we are going to go to the charity shop now and give some things away because we don't need them anymore. And there are other people who do. Let's talk about that. Whereas girls will just kind of say, right, I know, I can see my parents doing this, right? This is important to our family.
Ah, that's really interesting. So any of you that are listening that have got girls, you have an easier job than if you have boys. It'll probably be a good question actually for, I interviewed Rob Gardner on the podcast a few episodes ago. I'll pop the link in the show notes. Yeah, and he was talking about when he plays a game in schools to teach kids about money, is that often boys tend to be more risk takers than girls. So when in his game, like Rich Ricky comes on the phone and asks about, Rich Ricky said, if you give him all your money, he can double it overnight. And most of the boys will always jump on that opportunity, whereas the girls are a bit more cautious. So I think perhaps that is to do with just boys being more natural risk takers than girls. Yeah. But that's really, really interesting. Are there any other ways that parents can influence how we teach the next generation to be more philanthropic?
Yeah. So all of the research that I've done with this really focuses on, really basically just talking to the kids about it and making these conversations part of family life. So I've been really trying to build up my kids' library with books about, I found a couple books about child refugees, one about a homeless man, and just trying to incorporate these stories into our everyday conversations so that we're thinking about more than, just, what Lego game we're playing tonight. And talking about, when we pass a homeless person on the street, talking about what that must be like for them, and, that not everybody has the same opportunities that we do. So especially when they're young, I think it's really about just incorporating these stories into everyday life. When they get older, particularly in the preteens and the teens, the research says that it's appropriate to do more kind of family volunteering, maybe have the kids set up an account that is just for their own charitable giving, having them take part in decisions about family gifts. All these kinds of things can really help encourage the sense of charity within the family.
Yeah, that's lovely. I love some of those suggestions there. Can you think off the top of your head what some of those books are that you've been reading with your
Yeah,
children?
let me think.
And perhaps we can put those in the show notes.
Sure. So one of them is an American book, but I believe that I bought it on UK Amazon, called The Can Man, about a homeless man who collects cans for recycling. And there's another one that is about a refugee boy called Mustafa.
Okay. Great. Oh, well, we'll find those on Amazon and we'll pop those links in the show notes for people to have a look at. I've never come across either of those, so I'll definitely be having a look at those for my boys. That's wonderful. And in terms of then, so for us as women, what kind of things can we do right now to start thinking about creating a giving plan?
Sure. So I think the first step is to say you want to create a giving plan and to really be intentional about it, because so many times we give. What I did at actually the end of this last year is I sat down and thought about, wrote down all of the places that we had given over the past year. And I think this is a really useful exercise for anybody who wants to get a handle on their giving, because when I looked at it, it was, we'd given X amount to our alma mater. Giving to American universities is really big, is a big deal in the U.S. We'd given to a couple charity bike rides. We had a direct debit set up that I'd kind of forgotten about, and just really, I think it's important to just list all those things out, all of those donations that you've made, even in the past 6 months, and then sit back and think about it as yourself or with your spouse if you're giving together, and say, is this really is this really how we want to be practicing our philanthropy? And if it is, that's great. But if there's a way to incorporate some issues that you're really passionate about, then that's a time to say, right, we're going to set aside some time to research how we can put more money or other resources into this issue that we've decided that is quite important to us. And maybe we can stop giving stop giving as haphazardly as we've been doing in the past year.
And what about for people who are not, dare I say, currently making any contributions to charities or giving financially? What kind of questions can they ask of themselves to start thinking about maybe some of the some different ways or particular charities that they want to start contributing and supporting?
Sure. It's really easy to start. And the first thing I'd say to them is, that's absolutely fine that you're not giving already, but you probably are if you think about it. Pretty much everybody puts in £5 if somebody's asking for help on a charity run, or you've probably given to even a bake sale or something like that. So the first thing I'd say is, you're probably already giving, but that's wonderful that you want to be more intentional about it and maybe give a little bit more. And I think the first things to start thinking about are really the values that are important to you, that you want to support. In some cases, that's really supporting the local community, and maybe there's a new historic preservation effort that's coming up that you'd like to be a part of. Really taking a moment to take some stock of what's important to you. What would give you the most joy in knowing that you're supporting in the next year?
Yeah, lovely. I think what you said there as well about we're often doing more than we think we already are. I mean, the fact that most of us are invested in a pension through, either auto enrollment or contributing to our own, personal pensions. And by doing so, we're already investing. And if ethical investing, for example, is an area that is of interest, then perhaps actually explore, well, how are you already investing? Like, what funds are you invested in? Actually spend some time looking at, where your money is invested. Are there any alternatives? So could you be investing in an ethical fund, for example, with the company that your pension scheme is held with? Because often I think, particularly with things like auto enrollment, we're just thrown into this fund. We don't really have much say over we don't spend time thinking about what fund we're invested in. But actually, in reality, there's an opportunity there to have a look at, well, where is my money being invested? And could I have a bit more, a few more intentions about how that money's invested?
Exactly. It's small steps, but it really can make a big difference.
Yeah, fabulous. Fabulous. So just to finish off then, in terms of the interview today, so thank you so much for your time, Lauren. It's been really, really interesting to find out more about, how women can be, women and millennials really can be giving back through their wealth. Do you have any particular book recommendations that you could suggest to people who want to explore more about this subject?
Absolutely. Yeah, I have quite a lot, but I'll give some of my favorites. So right now I'm rereading a book that's a few years old, but I think still really relevant. It's called Giving 2.0, and it's about it really has a lot of examples of philanthropists, but it also gives examples of questions that you can ask yourself when you're thinking of becoming a more intentional giver at any level. So that's the one that I would probably recommend off the bat right now.
Great. And we'll pop a link to that in the show notes. And again, if you've got any other suggestions, we'll pop those in the show notes. What we have been doing with these podcast episodes as well, for anybody listening, is that we appreciate sometimes if you're listening to these shows when you're in the car or you're out walking the dog, that you haven't always got a pen and paper to hand. So we will pop all the references in the show notes, which you can also then find directly in a blog, which is always launched on the same day as the podcast episode. So it gives you an opportunity to go back to, grab those links at a time that's perhaps a bit more convenient. What about your favorite app, Lauren? Do you have a favorite app? Doesn't have to be money related, but what's your favorite app right now?
I gotta say the one that gets the most use on my phone is the Spotify app. Yeah, it mostly because it has that I can access the stream called Soothing Strings, which is what puts my kids to sleep at night.
Oh, that sounds genius.
Yeah, it's pretty important in our household.
I might pop a link to that in the show notes as well for anyone who's struggling to get their kids to sleep. And just one final question. If you could invite 3 celebrities to tea, who would you invite?
3. Okay. So I would start probably with Michelle Obama.
Oh, yeah.
Because I'm listening to her audiobook right now, Becoming, and I just love it. I mean, I loved her to begin with, but now I really do enjoy it. I'm really enjoying the book, so I would love to have her to tea. The other 2 would probably be current philanthropists, because I'd want to talk to them about their giving strategy and how they found their path and mistakes that they've made, because I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah. Awesome. That's a great, I haven't read Michelle Obama's book, actually. It's on my list I've got about 10 at the moment on my bookshelf that I need to work my way through, but I've seen the reviews on it. It looks fantastic. So yeah, that's definitely on my list to do. And just finally then, Lauren, if there's anybody who wants to find out more about the work that you do, I know that you do a lot of work with financial planners, and you help their clients to build a giving plan. And it is something that we're going to be offering to clients of the Money Panel as well, because we do a lot of work around people's relationship with money. And often the giving habitude comes up in conversation on many occasions, often either where clients aren't giving and want to be giving, or in some instances, I coached a woman recently who was, actually over giving to her own detriment. We were going through a spending exercise with her to see how she would be able to afford to move house, and she was spending a couple of £100 a month on charity contributions, which really she couldn't really afford, if you like, to manage within her budget. But they were non-negotiable. To her, they were very, very important. Actually, when I originally met her, about 10 years ago, when I was doing a charity trek in the Andes in Peru with my husband. So, it was so obvious that it was so important to her to maintain that contribution. It was so important to her that it was just non-negotiable. And I know that you do a lot of work with financial planners as to how they can help their clients to build, a sensible giving plan that enables them to give back in ways that are important to them. But if somebody wants to find out more about your work, Lauren, where can they find you?
Sure. I'm just at www.thoughtfulphilanthropy.com, or you can follow me on Twitter. I'm just Lauren Janus.
Fabulous. That's great. Well, thank you so much for your time, Lauren. It's been a pleasure, and have a lovely rest of your day.
Thanks so much. This has been fun.
Thank you so much for listening to the show today. I hope that you found that really useful, and it's given you some ideas as to how you can become empowered philanthropic givers. I feel comfortable saying that word now. Now, as always, I've put a link in the show notes to all of the discussions that we talked about today with Lauren, including her recommendations for the books, both for herself and for if you've got children. So I'll pop those notes in the show notes. You can also find these show notes now directly on our website. So we actually use the podcast and we have it put into a blog, so that for those of you who prefer to either go back to perhaps if you're listening to the podcast on a car journey and you haven't got access to pen and paper, then we make it easy for you to just grab those links from the blog. So do check that out over on the website, which is www.themoneypanel.co.uk. I'm also really excited to announce that myself and Lauren have gone into a collaboration together to offer the opportunity for you to explore your own gifting plan. So if you would like to find out a little bit more about what's your current giving strategy, what are you already doing, and what would be a personalised strategy for you going forward to enable you to set up your own gifting plan, then please do get in contact with me to discuss what that may look like. And you can do that either directly through the website, or you can pop me an email across on hello@themoneypanel.co.uk. That's hello, HELLO, @themoneypanel.co.uk. Thanks very much for listening, and I look forward to speaking to you again next week.